Well, the roles are reversed today. I am interviewing Hannes Wessels. Hannes and I have been doing this series, The Fighting Men of Rhodesia. And one of the things that I felt that would be really interesting would be to extend the scope of our channel to also include some of the interesting stories from the wilds of Africa. And often these are hunting stories, but just what it was like to be in Africa and to grow up in a different era in Africa. And Hannes was a professional white hunter, and therefore I felt he was highly qualified to talk about Africa and its wildlife. And so we're starting a series of focusing on the wildlife of Africa called Stories from the Wilds of Africa. And I wanted Hannes to give us an introduction to the series. Hannes, maybe you should tell us why you want to do the series.
Well, thanks, John. Firstly, I must just say, and my peers will concur, I don't rate myself as a wildlife expert in the true sense. I'm not a botanist and I'm not a scientist, but I am passionate about the cause for saving wildlife in Africa. And it's a complicated issue that has become mired in politics and in different agendas. And we'll come to that. But I'm hoping that in the course of this series, we can talk to some people more knowledgeable than I am to throw some light on where we are in Africa at this point in time regarding wildlife and what seems to be working in the conservation area and what isn't working. And as I say, it's a very controversial, emotional subject, but I really hope you and I can flesh out the right people and welcome all opinions as long as they are intelligent and credible, and try and help people around the world understand what is going on in Africa, because like everything, there are terrific misconceptions because people tend to push the line that suits them. And the reality on the ground is actually very different to what most people have been led to believe. And so I hope we can just set the record straight, really. And I'm really happy to be a part of this and to try and make that happen.
Mm. Hannes, you were a hunter. Why do you see yourself as a conservationist?
Well, John, like you, I think like so many of our era, the first book I read, I think, was Jock of the Bushveld. And it just fired up my imagination. Yeah. I always, I always had this idea that I would like to be in wild places, given the chance. And we were blessed as boys to have access to wild areas. So we all hunted and fished from a very early age. I mean, just behind where we lived, I could walk up into the mountains there with our gardener, and there was a chance that we'd see a leopard or a blue duiker or a bushbuck. Mm. So we all had a taste for it from an early age. And then I was lucky enough to meet Robert Rock also at a young age, and his books on Kenya fired me up enormously. And I just, I suppose I'm a bit of a romantic in a way, and I had this vision of living that kind of life. So after the army and after university, I was actually prosecuting. I was in the criminal courts, and that's another story. But I felt this wasn't really where I wanted to be in life, and so I took off and joined my friend Trevor Lane, who gave me a job in the wildlife field in Matabeleland. And that was really the beginning. And then I went up to Zambia and Tanzania, spent a little bit of time in Mozambique. But I was blessed in a way. Had some wonderful years. I went to some places in Africa I would never have got to otherwise. I met fascinating people, both as clients and as colleagues in the hunting game. And I feel very strongly about the value of hunting when it comes to conservation, but that's where we are getting into controversial territory. But it's certainly an area that I have opinions on, and I'm very happy to articulate.
Do you think trophy bans help?
No, John, I absolutely don't. If they did, I promise you I would be supportive of them. It's the old story, really. Everybody likes to take aim at the usual suspects, and in the hunting game, white hunters are the villains of the game, I suppose, of the piece, and so it's nice to take a shot at them. And the latest individual to enter this particular fray is Prime Minister Boris Johnson's partner, Carrie Simons, who's now making a name for herself as the leader of the anti-hunting brigade in the UK. And I've just got to say, I have nothing but contempt for her and the people who support her. I just see this as another misguided effort. But people are inclined to make pronouncements that attract the most applause. And the world, the majority of people are just instinctively anti-hunting. So if you want to jump on a popular bandwagon, get on the anti-hunting one and call for a ban on trophy hunting. And everybody then imagines some big, fat, rich Brit or American or German shooting something in Africa and bringing the trophy home. And everybody loves to hate that particular person. So this is virtue signaling at its best. The fact is, what most people don't know, nor do they want to know, is in Africa, the areas that can be set aside for commercial photographic safaris are dwindling all the time because of population pressure and for one reason or another. So you have these other wildlife areas that are extremely marginal, and they don't have the populations to attract non-consumptive tourism, which is photographic. The only people who can make these areas viable are the hunters, and they can do it very, very successfully by taking off a very limited number of animals and utilizing that revenue to sustain those areas. And if you take them out, there is absolutely no protective mechanism in place whatsoever. And those areas are quickly poached into oblivion. And that is the end of the wildlife in those particular areas. I've seen it happen many, many times over my career in wildlife. And it's happened again quite recently with the collapse in travel because of COVID. The hunters haven't actually been able to sustain themselves. So they haven't been able to police their areas. And this has been a very sad development for wildlife in general. You know, where I've got a problem with people like Carrie Simons, and there are millions of them out there actually, who all shout and scream about the hunters, but none of them have actually got any better solutions to offer. Once you've vilified the hunters and driven them out of their areas, then you have a vacuum which they are completely and utterly unable to fill. But they don't care about it. The reality is very far away. Everybody cheers because the white hunter has been banished or whatever, but there are no solutions. And this is why I'm so contemptuous of these people. If they had something better to offer, I would be most respectful of them. I don't celebrate the killing of animals, but I understand why it's needed, particularly in the African context. You've also got to take into account the fact that most African countries are poorly governed and poorly policed. If these were first world countries where you had an effective conservation department deployed to protect these areas, then it would be different. But that is absolutely not the case in Africa. It's the private sector that is absolutely imperative in the wildlife equation. Take them out, and there is very, very little left, sadly.
Hannes, I'm not really qualified to talk about this, but for example, I had a friend who was very keen on game bird hunting, and he bought a farm that had absolutely no game birds on it at all. And he stocked it with pheasant and with grouse and with quail and with guinea fowl. And he grew the type of crops that would create a healthy game bird population on his farm. And over the years, his farm became an absolute mecca for game bird hunting because it had such a healthy population of game birds, and the guys used to come with their shotguns and everything. And I mean, that's an example of a guy who took over a farm that had nothing in terms of wildlife, and he turned it into a little paradise for the game birds. And thereby, you know, through his hobby, he sort of brought that wildlife back. You know, I don't know.
Well, yeah, John. I mean, there are lots of stories like that. You know, this whole hunting debate, you've only actually got to look at the South African experience today. It was applicable in Zimbabwe as well, but political events have impacted very negatively on the privately owned wildlife estate in Zimbabwe. But the Zimbabwean model was also very successful. But in South Africa, you have a surfeit of wildlife, and it's entirely due, well, almost entirely due to hunting. Through very well-controlled, well-managed, privately owned areas, the South African wildlife estate is a place of abundant wildlife. And if you could spread this, if you could take this model into the rest of Africa, it would, there's no doubt in my mind, it would turn things around almost immediately. But you've got to give the landowner or the private individual security of tenure in that particular area, and he has to be able to utilize that resource without bureaucratic interference. And unfortunately, that seldom happens in Africa. But the South African model as it exists today is really actually all one needs to look at if one's serious about understanding the value of hunting. I don't want to detract from what happens in the photographic areas. There's some excellent operators out there who do an amazing job of protecting the areas that they operate in, and looking after the community. I mean, it works very well, and hats off to them. But unfortunately, the areas where you can generate a decent return from photographic tourism are dwindling, and they're hard to come by.
Yeah.
But I don't take anything away from the photographic operators either.
What about the World Wildlife Fund, Hannes?
John, I might have missed something, but in my experience in Africa and in wildlife, I've seen very little evidence of them doing anything useful. Most of them are overpaid bureaucrats who you will see driving around African capital cities in new Land Cruisers, but in the field, very little evidence, of them doing anything useful. My experience with the World Wildlife Fund and related UN affiliated bodies is not a very high one. Most of these organizations are very conscious of ingratiating themselves to the powers that be. So they don't like anything that might run contrary to what the political views are in that particular country. So when it comes to actually dealing with the harsh reality of conservation, and the reality is a harsh one, because the anti-poaching game is not for the faint-hearted. I have lost several good friends, all hunters, well, most of them hunters in one shape or form or another, who have been killed in action against poachers. It's tough out there, and it takes commitment and courage. And I haven't found that terribly forthcoming from these NGOs. They have huge budgets, massive amounts of money to spend, but they prefer to spend it where it appears, where I have seen little effect, put it that way.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to get some of these anti-poaching heroes to tell us a few of their stories. I'm really excited about this whole series. I think this whole series is going to be totally awesome, because I mean, half of the mystique of Africa is the wildlife, isn't it? I mean, that's just...
Well, you're absolutely right. You know, John, that's what we all want. Africa without its wildlife just somehow loses its luster.
Yeah.
And you know, it's becoming increasingly difficult because, thanks to poor governance and overpopulation, people are getting poorer, and there are more and more people. So the pressure on the wildlife areas is increasing at an alarming rate. So the threat to wildlife has never been as great as it is now. So it really does require, you know, urgent attention, and based on realism. You know, too many people have got their heads in the clouds. People have to be accommodated, but if you're serious about wildlife, you've got to find some way of dealing with the humanitarian demands.
How does the global warming agenda fit in? I mean, the proponents are all for saving the environment. Does this bode well for the wildlife?
Good. I wish it did. You would think so. These people claim to be trying to save the planet and save nature and save natural resources. Well, I don't want to be too critical, but I see a massive amount of hypocrisy, and I actually don't take them seriously at all. I think the proponents are, in the main, a bunch of frauds, starting with former Vice President Al Gore, who got the world terribly excited about this whole thing. It all turned out to be based on rubbish as far as I can make out. But where I run into trouble with them is I say, well, look, if you really are concerned about the planet, and if you happen to be concerned about Africa, rather than the fat capitalists and Donald Trump, who seem to be the focus of their attentions, then the biggest problem in Africa really is poor governance and overpopulation and poverty. But nobody's interested in getting involved in addressing that problem, because now you might be running into controversial territory. If you stand up and say, look, people need to breed more responsibly and have smaller families that are manageable, then you're probably going to get yourselves into awful trouble. I'm probably about to do the same myself, but it's a fact. It's the truth. Too many people, highly unsophisticated agricultural methodology. So we have a slash and burn situation, which is prevalent throughout Africa. And there's no sustainability. I mean, these people talk about sustainability all the time, but they don't seem to give a damn about the fact that we see precious little of it in Africa as these populations increase. So the future for the wildlife estate is terribly bleak under the present circumstances, unless there's some change. But I don't see that coming, because people don't really want to face up to the truth again. They like to hang on to what they sort of want to believe, and so everybody rejoices in this this fabulous population explosion that's going on in Africa. And then you have all the philanthropists, people like Bill Gates, who are investing money in actually accelerating this growth. And they get accolades for it. But the reality is, where does it end up? And you know, you talk about global warming, but what about all the deforestation in Africa? Where are the Al Gores of the world and the Bill Gateses of the world when it comes to the fact that these forests are disappearing before our very eyes? Every year, Africa, virtually the whole continent, is set alight by irresponsible people burning for various reasons. And they just burn virtually the whole continent down. God knows how much carbon dioxide disappears into the atmosphere out of Africa. But you won't hear a whisper of criticism from any of these people. And that's why I just can't take them seriously. I think they're a bunch of frauds with their own agendas. And I'm just sorry that they aren't more useful when there is a real problem to be addressed.
Great, Hannes. Well, I'm really looking forward to this series, and I'm really looking forward to some of the interesting guys that you're going to be interviewing. And I know you've already got some great guys lined up. like Mike Bromwich, who wrote that book about the national parks and wildlife in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
And who's much more interested in talking about the wildlife than he is in talking about the war. Yeah, so guys, I hope you all stay tuned and watch this space, and subscribe to our channel. Press the notification bell so that you'll get notified when we put our next videos up. Hannes, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to end off with, or?
Just to reiterate that I want to include as many people from across the spectrum in wildlife. A lot of the people I know who have got great stories and who I think can add a lot to this program are people with a hunting background. But that doesn't mean to say we only want this to be to revolve around the hunters. So yeah, I'd like it to be. I'd like us to be as open-minded and inclusive as we possibly can. I mean, I would love Mrs. Simons to present herself and explain to the world how she sees a ban on trophy hunting changing the course of wildlife conservation in Africa. I think last year, something like 38 people from the UK, I could be wrong, but it's a ridiculously small number of people, came hunting in Africa. So she, with all her grandstanding, is going to make sure that the next 38 who go to Africa can't take their trophies home. And this is somehow going to help African wildlife. Well, I don't know. I don't know what to say.